All right. Assalamu alaikum and good morning. This is our fourth session and first for the day. This session is about the challenge of nationalism, and we have three renowned scholars and esteemed academics who would address these issues from three different perspectives: the Indian subcontinent, the Arab world, and Turkey. Our moderator for the day is Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian. Dr. Abdullah is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He received his doctorate in history from Georgetown University and wrote his dissertation on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt during the decade of the 70s. He received his master's degree from the London School of Economics in the sociology of religion and his bachelor degree in political science from Duke University. He's the editor of the Critical Currents on the Islam page in Jadaliyah, and he received several awards that allowed him to conduct field research in many countries. His book, entitled Answering the Call: Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt, was published by Oxford University. He's currently writing a book that explores the relationship between nationalism and Islamism, or the tendency of Islamic political movements to adopt the nation-state paradigm in pursuit of their activist mission. Please welcome with me our panel.
Good morning. I'm happy to be introducing this panel. I'll be chairing, moderating, and so we'll be looking forward very much to your contributions as well after the presenters have had a chance to speak. First, I'd like to introduce our panel to you. Our first speaker will be Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal, who's an assistant professor of South Asian history at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. She completed her PhD in history and women's studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and her bachelor's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Her dissertation was titled Building a New Kashmir: Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad and the Politics of State Formation in a Disputed Territory, 1953 to 63. She's a founding member of Critical Kashmir Studies, a network that promotes critical scholarship and engagement on the region. Dr. Kanjwal has written and provided critical analysis for a variety of news outlets, including the Washington Post, Al Jazeera English, and many others. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sarah Sheilds, who earned her PhD from the University of Chicago and who's been at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill since 1993, where she's now professor and director of graduate studies. Her book, Fezzes in the River: Identity Politics and European Diplomacy in the Middle East on the Eve of World War II, was published by Oxford Press in 2011, and it is a social and diplomatic history of the contest between France and Turkey over the Sanjak of Alexandretta. Her previous book, Mosul Before Iraq, Like Bees Making Five-Sided Cells, analyzes the economy and society of 19th century Mosul and the region surrounding it. She's currently researching the long-term impact of the League of Nations on the Middle East, and she teaches courses on modern Middle East history, as well as the history of Iraq, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and water in the Middle East, and many others. And our final speaker will be Dr. Sener Akturk, who's an associate professor at Koç University here in Istanbul. His research and teaching focus is on comparative politics, ethnicity, religion, and nationalism. He received his BA and MA degrees from the University of Chicago and his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He was a postdoctoral fellow in the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and a visiting lecturer in the Department of Government both at Harvard University. His book, Regimes of Ethnicity and Nationhood in Germany, Russia, and Turkey, was published by Cambridge in 2012. He's received a number of awards and published several articles as well, so we can, I guess, move quickly to our panel. Our first talk is titled The Paradox of Nationalism in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Kashmir. Dr. Hafsa, you have 20 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for making it to the morning panel. We appreciate you being here. I know it's always hard to get in the morning. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and for Dr. Al-Arian for inviting me to this conference. It's really been very exciting to meet so many excellent people, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversations. So this panel is about the challenge of nationalism in Muslim societies. In my talk, I plan to explore how nationalism emerged in the context of Muslim South Asia, a vast expanse of land that stretches from northwest Pakistan, bordering Afghanistan, to southern Bangladesh. Here, I'll focus on 3 different case studies. 1, Muslim nationalism that led to the creation of the state of Pakistan, Bengali nationalism that led to the creation of the state of Bangladesh, as well as Kashmiri nationalism, which seeks independence from Indian rule. I'll consider the relationship between these nationalisms, how Muslim thinkers and leaders in the subcontinent have grappled with and envisioned indigenous forms of nationalism, and how these forms interact with regional and religious identities. My title is entitled The Paradox of Nationalism. On the one hand, nationalism was a powerful tool of Muslim empowerment during the period of decolonization in the Indian subcontinent. In fact, nationalism continues to be a powerful leverage for those Muslim-led movements that seek national liberation even today. On the other hand, however, it is nationalism itself that has set the boundaries when it comes to handling diversity. Pluralistic religious identities and ethnic identities have seen themselves squashed under the broader logic of nationalism. In doing so, it is nationalism that has limited and prevented Muslim unity and solidarity across South Asia. So much so that it has led to the emergence of new nationalisms and new nation states in South Asia. At the root of the challenge of nationalism to South Asia's Muslims is how to negotiate multiple identities within a single body politic. While I don't have the time to go into Hindu nationalism or secular nationalism in India in this talk, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have during the Q&A. Muslim nationalism in South Asia began, as some scholars have argued, with Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. The Sir is because he was knighted by the British, the founder of the famous Aligarh Muslim University in the second half of the 19th century. While Sir Syed did not himself call for a separate nation state or political structure for Muslims, he began to articulate the sentiment that the Muslims of India were a separate community with distinct political interests in a larger political structure. There were 2 primary developments that influenced Sir Syed's thinking. The first was the context of a declining Mughal empire, which had essentially lost all power during the first rebellion against the British, known as the 1857 Rebellion. The Muslim nobility that enjoyed political power under the Mughals were now left to finding their own way in the new colonial structure. The British, of course, blamed the 1857 rebellion on the Muslims in particular, deploying tropes of the Muslim with the Quran in the one hand and the sword in the other. The second was in relation to the development of the actual nature of colonial rule. British colonialism enabled a form of social engineering between the religious communities on the ground, whereby colonial forms of government, including something as simple as the census, formed communities that began to privilege religious identity over all other identities, including region and ethnicity. With the results of the census, Muslim scholars, such as Sir Syed, began to realize that the Hindus formed a majority in most parts of the subcontinent, and that Muslims would be politically marginalized. They would go from being a ruling class under the Mughals to a religious minority. Here, it is important to note that the colonial logic of majority versus minority, expedited by the electoral process, created the space for Muslim nationalist thought to take hold. In addition, Muslims in the subcontinent were especially aware that the Hindu community enjoyed better relations with the British after the rebellion, and that without a Muslim ruler, their rights could be easily cast aside. Given that earlier attempts to unite the Muslim community by Muslim reformers had not succeeded, particularly due to doctrinal and theological differences, Sir Syed utilized the concept of the Muslims as a qawm, or nation, in order to overcome the challenges inherent to colonial rule and find some coherence for India's diverse Muslims. He articulated that the intellectual and social predicaments affecting the Muslim community, and in contrast to the ulama, situated modern education as the only gateway from India's Muslims to progress, to become rational, and to modernize. He was primarily interested in improving the conditions of India's Muslims under British rule, for which he was criticized by leaders such as Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who saw Muslims as a global community, or an ummah, that had to utilize modern education to ultimately defeat imperialism and to establish a broader Islamic caliphate. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the loss of political power, the predominance of British colonialism, as well as the political reassertion of Hindus, led the Muslims to situate themselves as a distinct political and cultural community with separate interests. Sir Syed would not have imagined that his project to educationally empower and modernize India's Muslims would eventually lead them to formulate nationalist aspirations. In the first half of the 20th century, as representation devolved from the British to their Indian subjects, Indian Muslims became fearful of Hindu domination and a future transfer of power. This fear intensified during the period of British constitutional reforms, which designated separate electorates for the Muslims of the subcontinent. In separate electorates, religious groups selected members of their own communities as representatives. While separate electorates affirmed that Muslims were a political entity separate from the Hindus, they also relegated them to being a perpetual minority in any future government setup. In this time, Muhammad Ali Jinnah founded the Muslim League to represent Muslim political interests and counter the majoritarian aims of the Indian National Congress, which was the primary political party leading the fight against British colonial rule. The Indian National Congress was ostensibly secular and had the support of a number of Muslim political and religious organizations. Indeed, Jinnah's own political career had begun with the Congress. However, he became increasingly wary of the party's rhetoric of secularism while not taking steps to ensure that Hindu majoritarianism would not prevail and that Muslim political interests would be accounted for. As early as 1930, the Muslim League began to articulate the idea of Pakistan, although it was only officially named some years after. The idea of Pakistan initially did not amount to a modern nation state. This is perhaps one of the greatest ironies of the time, given the way in which historical amnesia in both India and Pakistan has sought to argue otherwise. While the Muslim community wanted to be recognized as a nation that had political parity with the Hindu population, its leading proponents like Allama Iqbal and Muhammad Ali Jinnah did not initially articulate the demand for Pakistan as a separate nation state. In his presidential address to the Muslim League in 1930, Allama Iqbal argued for a need to have strong Muslim-majority provinces in a larger federation, one or more Muslim states with absolute majorities that would be a part of and not separate from a larger Indian federation. Within this structure, each religious community would be able to develop according to their own cultural traditions. Yet, he did not define these boundaries territorially, but rather culturally. He was skeptical of the future of nationalism for Muslims. In the same address, he stated, "At the present moment, the national idea is racializing the outlook of Muslims, and thus materially counteracting the humanizing work of Islam. As the growth of racial consciousness may mean the growth of standards different from and even opposed to the standards of Islam." The idea of a broader community of believers was integral to Iqbal's political thought, yet changes in the global order, especially after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, led him to argue for the unity of the Muslim world that would have to be derived from the independent and sovereign status of individual Muslim states. He wrote, "It seems to me that God is slowly bringing home to us the truth that Islam is neither nationalism nor imperialism, but a league of nations which recognizes artificial boundaries and racial distinctions for facility of reference only, and not for restricting the social horizon of its members." It would be in this League of Muslim countries that Indian Muslims would participate and contribute to a broader Muslim world. Iqbal's vision articulated a connection between the proposed Muslim state in South Asia and the territorially broken up but spiritually united nation states across the Muslim world. This was an attempt to reconcile Islam with nationalism. While Iqbal remained the passionate spokesman for Indian Muslims' aspirations, it was Muhammad Ali Jinnah that took the idea of Pakistan and translated it to a viable power-sharing mechanism to the various roundtable conferences. However, Jinnah deliberately kept what Pakistan entailed vague and at times contradictory, which also led to multiple interpretations and discussions on the ground amongst Muslims in various social classes and regions about the nature of this idea called Pakistan. Jinnah used the two-nation theory to situate his demand for greater political parity. He argued that Muslims and Hindus were two nations with divergent and antagonistic cultural identities that were incapable of merging into a single nationality within the same state. While earlier historiography on Jinnah, especially from Indian nationalists, has argued that Jinnah's two-nation theory exemplified his demand for a separate nation-state of Pakistan, scholars like Aisha Jalal have argued that Jinnah used the idea of Pakistan as a bargaining chip or a leveraging point to get the Indian National Congress and the British to come forward and assure Muslim parity on a political level. As debates waged on between the British, the Muslim League, and the Indian National Congress, it was the latter, the Indian National Congress's refusal to share power with the Muslim League, that led to the partition and the creation of Pakistan as an inevitable nation-state. One of the important themes that emerges from this discussion is the central role of Muslim modernists, most of whom had been educated in Western institutions, in articulating the need for Pakistan. The traditional ulama and groups like the Deoband and the Jamaat-e-Islam were opposed to the creation of Pakistan, stating that it was un-Islamic to create a state out of a religious identity. The Jamaat under Maulana Maududi was to later change its stance once Pakistan was established. Pakistan was created during one of the bloodiest periods of the 20th century. The boundaries of the new nation-state did not correspond to Iqbal and Jinnah's vision, and consequently the Muslim-majority regions of Punjab and Bengal were partitioned. Nearly 15 million people were displaced, and over 1 million people were killed in the ensuing communal violence. Debates over the relationship between Islam, Muslim identity, and the new nation-state remained unresolved, as various political parties put forth different religious ideologies. Was Pakistan to be an Islamic state or simply a secular state comprised of Muslims? What role would it play in the broader Muslim world? As the new nation struggled to find a united, cohesive national identity that set it apart from India, it increasingly relied upon Islam, and in particular, a Sunni majoritarian Islam, to manage the assertion of various regional and linguistic identities, including the Sindhis, the Pathans, the Bengalis, Balochis, and the Muhajirs, or Urdu-speaking refugees from North India. Various regions decried the Punjabi-dominated state machinery. Urdu, a language that was only spoken by 3% of the population of the new nation, was declared the official language. This decision faced immediate resistance, especially in Bengal, where Bengali leaders argued that Bengali was the primary language for over 50% of the national population. Under colonial rule, the British had replaced Persian with Urdu as the official language, it was increasingly seen as a symbol of Muslim nationalism in North India. For the new Pakistani nation-state, Urdu was deployed as the official language, as it was the language that would unify the diverse regions. In addition, there was significant geographical distance between the two wings of the new state, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which would later become Bangladesh. Tensions arose in East Pakistan in the post-partition period. The Bengalis were a numerical majority, but their leadership, despite obtaining a majority of votes in national level elections, was marginalized. As a result of economic marginalization from West Pakistan and political exclusion, Bengalis looked to mobilize against the Pakistan state. Ironically then, Bengali nationalist mobilization in the 1960s was a result of similar circumstances that the Muslim League had faced some decades prior. The leader of the Awami League, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, articulated a 6-point movement calling for greater autonomy and not initially a nation-state. Resistance and repression from West Pakistan led to a bloody war of liberation in 1971, which is when the state of Bangladesh came into being. While the Pakistan state blames India for fueling Bengali nationalism to undermine Pakistan, the claim is often overstated. Certainly, India did exploit existing tensions between East and West Pakistan, but the breakup of Pakistan was ultimately a result of Pakistani nationalism and its inability to accommodate the multiple linguistic and ethnically diverse groups in the country. In the 1970s and 1980s, Bangladesh and Pakistan increasingly sought recourse to greater Islamization as both states struggled to meet the challenge of post-colonial national and religious identities. Both examples underscore how contingent the process of nationalism was for South Asia's Muslims and how it was inextricably tied to the structures of the colonial state. The creation of the state of Bangladesh was to have a significant impact on another Muslim-majority region in the Indian subcontinent, the state of Jammu and Kashmir. In many ways, we can say that it resuscitated a previous bid for independence or self-rule. During the period of British colonial rule, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir had a Muslim majority and a Hindu ruler who was seen as being oppressive towards the Muslim population. Beginning in 1931, Kashmiris called for a more representative government and better educational and economic opportunities, especially for the region's Muslims. Kashmiri nationalism thus emerged in the pre-partition period as educated Kashmiri Muslims, along with a number of Kashmiri Hindus called Pandits belonging to the Brahmin caste, began to articulate the demand for a Naya or new Kashmir. Influenced deeply by leftist and socialist trends across the subcontinent, they called for a socialist, democratic, secular state. In its manifesto, it is decreed that the Muslim majority would safeguard the rights of its religious minorities, both Hindus and Sikhs. However, this nationalism became entangled within the broader political currents of the time. The state had the option of acceding to either of the two dominions, although by the logic of partition, which ruled that Muslim majority areas would go to Pakistan, it should have technically joined Pakistan. A murky transfer of sovereignty led a majority of the territory to be incorporated into the Indian Union with promises of autonomy. After a war erupted between India and Pakistan, a UN resolution called for a plebiscite to be held in the region once hostilities had ceased. In the post-partition period, the political possibilities available to Kashmiris became increasingly limited. With only the option of Pakistan or India on the table, the political leadership continued to oscillate between the two in its bid to secure some form of recognition of self-rule. Popularly, the demand was for self-determination, a category that had been adopted from UN resolutions. It was only in the 1960s and the 1970s, as more and more Kashmiris became educated and traveled outside of Kashmir, that political thought began to incorporate ideas of national liberation. A number of factors contributed to the development of the idea of independence amongst Kashmiris in the 1960s and 1970s. The first was the increasing disappointment with the state of Pakistan, which most Kashmiri Muslims had previously supported. To many student activists of the time, it appeared that Pakistan was not genuinely interested in the welfare of Kashmiris. This sentiment increased after the breakup of the country and the creation of Bangladesh. As Kashmiris observed the war of liberation, the justification for joining Pakistan as a state that would safeguard all Muslims began to unravel. The search for Muslim unity turned bleak. If Pakistan could not hold on to Bengal, what would be the fate of Kashmiris? As a result, some in the political leadership decided to secure a final deal with India, serving as local collaborators, while others began to espouse a more explicit form of Kashmiri nationalism. Increasingly, the first party that stood for independence of the whole region of Jammu and Kashmir was in the Pakistan-occupied side of Kashmir, called the National Liberation Front. This movement gained greater traction in the Kashmiri diaspora in the United Kingdom under Amanullah Khan. Kashmiri leaders and activists were heavily influenced by developments across the global south, including the Algerian War, as well as the language of national liberation. In Indian-occupied Kashmir, a movement called the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, or JKLF, was formed, and it stood for a secular nationalist independent state. During the militancy of the late 1980s and early 90s, when some Kashmiris took up arms against the Indian state, with JKLF playing a pivotal role, along with support from Pakistan. However, because the JKLF represented a pro-independence Kashmiri nationalist organization, it became a target for both the Indian and the Pakistani state. It was undermined and the militancy became divided. There were those that wanted independence and there were others that pushed a pro-Pakistan agenda. India was able to exploit these differences and effectively crush that phase of the militancy. Even today, as Kashmiri youth have, since 2010, begun to mobilize once more against the Indian state, Kashmiri nationalism continues to have an uneasy relationship with Pakistani nationalism. There are some who argue that Pakistan is a Muslim country, and thus it would make sense for Kashmir to accede to Pakistan. In addition, they maintain that Pakistan had regularly raised the issue of Kashmir in the international community and has, in effect, kept the issue alive. However, those who favor independence argue that the Pakistan state is only interested in Kashmir for its geopolitical and strategic interest, that it is the Kashmir issue that allows, in part, for Pakistan to continue to maintain a strong military. There's no concern for Kashmiris themselves, and if Kashmir was to join Pakistan, its distinct cultural and political identity would be subjugated in a country that already has a number of existing problems with its various provinces. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from the experiences with nationalism in South Asia? One of the important aspects to consider in this discussion is how intrinsically nationalism itself was linked to political and social empowerment of the respective Muslim communities. This is perhaps what the two, nationalism and Islamism, have in common, and also why they have converged at various points. People respond to these projects not just in relation to their ideas of community, but rather what they promise to offer socially. In addition, not all of these movements began with the idea of a nation-state in mind, with defined territories, although that slowly came to be the case as this was what the range of political possibility amounted to. Thus, we need to consistently bear in mind that nationalism has a strong appeal because it provides a way out of the colonial predicaments of economic miseries and political suppression. Nonetheless, when these nations become nation-states, they fail to resolve the question of diversity, allowing a central ethno-nationalist narrative to emerge. These nationalisms attempted to articulate a singular narrative that was exclusive and tended to be monolithic. It did not enable forms of multiculturalism, whether religious or linguistic, that the region had been privy to in the pre-colonial period. This begs a few questions that I will leave you with. Do attempts to signal to a broader Muslim identity or the notion of an ummah homogenize and override the complicated and real diversity of language, region, politics, and ethnicity that all Muslim societies grapple with? Is it a majoritarian impulse? How do we maintain a universalist commitment to Muslim unity as well as respect for and acknowledgement of ethnic and cultural differences? And do the failures of the South Asian examples showcase an untenable link between nationalism and Islam? Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Dr. Sheilds, who will be talking to us about rethinking nationalism and ethnic identities in the Middle East.
First, I want to say thank you to Dr. Sami, to all of the students and staff who have managed to keep me from getting lost for a few days. And to the people who have come before, I've never had this situation before. You usually sort of just wait your turn and then get up and do your talk. But I actually had to spend a significant amount of time last night rewriting the conclusion because I'd really been thinking about how other people's work relates to my own. And for that, I'm very grateful to have an opportunity to be here. So decades ago, when I was an undergraduate, I was fascinated by George Antonius's magisterial book, The Arab Awakening. Writing in 1938, he told the story of how Arab intellectual elites had come to understand their own collective identity, had awoken, as it were, to Arabism. I was so enthralled with his story that I wrote my big paper for my junior year on Arab nationalism. It seems I've not yet stopped thinking about nationalism in the Middle East. Here I am, 41 years later, still writing and talking about it. But my research has taken me in a very different direction, one which has been very unexpected and is sometimes quite uncomfortable. The romantic tale of collective self-identification, of coming around to self-knowledge and the resulting activism, is a very appealing one. Many scholars more qualified than I am have pointed out the challenges with his tale, though. Antonius emphasized only a certain class of people, intellectual elites, too often minorities, thinking their way to identities not yet reflecting their own lives or the lives of the people around them. Rashid Khalidi Bek in the 1980s reviewed what he called the problems of the literature on Arab nationalism for the Journal of Record in my field, the Arab American Historical Review. Other towering figures in the field have joined him in analyzing the origins and nature of nationalism in the Middle East, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism, and state nationalisms. James Galvin more recently reviewed the literature and pointed to a transition from Antonius's elite-based thought nationalism to a broad-based social history study of collective identities. Before, I don't really want to do a major historiographical review of the literature. I have colleagues here who could do it much more adeptly. But I want to talk about nationalism as a project. And in this, I'm very grateful to Hafsa, who came before me and asked some of these same questions. Nationalism, as I understand it as a historian as opposed to as a nationalist, is the recognition of the existence of what Benedict Anderson termed an imagined community. It's imagined because people don't know all of its members, and without having any direct contact with most of the people in the community they imagined, nationalists understand nonetheless that they share something, an identity, an affiliation, a language, a map, a history, with all these other unseen members. His imagined community exists in people's minds and in their museums, not in the streets. It means feeling a shared affinity with a community one cannot know, but takes basically on faith. But if we take Anderson's imagined community as the definition of nationalism, as most historians today seem to, then community is a nation, the nation becomes a state embodying, reflecting, and housing that community. I want you to think about the difference between nationalism and anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism. When the Algerians fought the French for more than a century following the 1830 invasion, for example, they were not fighting for the creation of an Algerian nation. They were fighting to retake their own territory from brutal foreign conquest and control. Anti-imperial movements can be nationalist, but they are not always or necessarily so. Frequently, nationalist struggles break out after foreign control has been dislodged. It is only at that point that the freedom fighters struggle to decide who belongs in the nation and who is an outsider. So much for defining nationalism. A brief historical context. Most historians conclude that nationalism is a result of the age of revolutions, especially the 19th century. It makes sense. If legitimacy in Europe until the 19th century was based on the rights of kings and the responsibility of subjects, it didn't matter what those subjects called themselves. They didn't have to imagine a community. So in France before 1789, for example, people spoke a variety of regional languages: Breton, Basque, Gascon, Occitan, Provençal, all of which, regardless of languages, were subjects of the king, and nationalism didn't matter. But when the people rose against the king's tyranny, the new polity needed a different form of legitimacy. During the 19th century in France, in Germany, and Italy, nationalist movements rose to bring disparate regions together to create a French nation, a German nation, an Italian nation. In the post-revolutionary inversion, kings and parliaments represented the people with this new supposedly common language and supposedly unified state territory. As is common, though, with things European, Europeans insist that their new arrangement was the highest level of civilization. Their new ideology, the illustration of true progress, their novel political order, became, in their minds, the uppermost rung on the ladder of progress. Anyone who wanted to be anyone, who wanted to be modern and rational and have their claims recognized, had to claim to be a nation. Indeed, at the end of World War I, a horrific conflagration fought according to Western leaders in the name of frustrated nationalism, the new institution that would bring world peace was called the League of Nations. Anyone who mattered would make their claims to territory and representation based on this new ideology of nationalism. So nationalism became the thing one had to be modern and progressive. And Arab leaders and Akturk, though I will leave that to someone else to discuss, decided that they had to be national too. At the end of World War I, statehood could, after all, only be achieved through national claims. If local populations wanted to rid themselves of foreign occupation, they had to claim national rights of self-government, or as Lenin put it, self-determination of peoples. But the people of Damascus did not rise up in 1920 because they were Syrian nationalists. They rose because they hated the French, just like the Druze did 5 years later. The massive uprising in 1920 against the British wasn't because the people of Baghdad and Basra were frustrated Iraqis, but because they didn't want foreigners to control their territories. Historians have called these popular movements nationalism because we're all trained in the West, including many of the people in the Middle East who write this history, and grown-up people have to be nationalist. Zionist settlers claimed that people in Ottoman and Mandate Palestine weren't a nation because they didn't have their own flags and they didn't identify as one exclusionary group. But the population of Nablus and Jerusalem and Jaffa didn't have to be nationalists to oppose foreign settlers who threatened their peace, their homes, their orchards, their schools, their cemeteries, their lives, and their livelihoods. I've come to this view of Middle East nationalism quite by surprise. I started doing research in the League of Nations archives to illustrate the effects of nationalism by analyzing struggles over post-war borderlands. So I took on 2 episodes. I want to share both right now. 2 times the League of Nations was called on to assign disputed territories. Because of their own assumptions about nations and belonging, League officials absolutely knew that if they could only ascertain the identities of populations in the disputed areas, they would know where to place the contested regions. People's identities would necessarily determine their political preferences, according to this new ideology of collective identities and nation-states. Quite simple it would be. If there were more Turks in the Mosul province, then clearly the province should become part of Turkey. If there were more Arabs, it should be connected with Baghdad. The League of Nations commissioners went to Mosul in 1925 to carry out this a survey, basically a census, but they brought with them 2 incorrect assumptions. First, the commissioners concluded that it was not so simple to find out what people's identities were. Turks, Arabs, and Kurds had all married each other over the years. They spoke multiple languages, and so assigning the territory to the predominant group would have been a challenge, especially since the largest group turned out to be Kurds who didn't have a state. Second, those commissioners were startled to discover that in any case, identity did not predetermine political desire. The Orientalist assumption on its face is astonishing. How could knowing someone was a Turk tell you what political future he had in mind? Did all Frenchmen have the same political goals? Nonetheless, the commissioners, 1 Hungarian, 1 Belgian, and 1 Swedish, all assumed that if they only knew whether the people were Arab or Turk, they would know what they wanted. But the people of Mosul were not nationalists in the 1920s. They were people concerned with livelihoods, families, connections, trade, and belief. Some Arabic speakers insisted they wanted to be part of Turkey, even though they were Arabic speakers, because they didn't want to be under British control in the Iraq Mandate. Some Turkish speakers, on the other hand, wanted to be with Iraq because Ataturk was way too secular. Some Arabs whose trade connections were with Turkey wanted to be on the Arab side of the border, while Turks who traded mostly, you get the idea. Turks who traded mostly with Baghdad preferred Iraq. People were complicated, as people generally are, and even if the population hadn't intermarried and spoken many languages and had family members on both sides of the possible border demarcations, even if it were possible to know who they were, those considerations of identity did not determine their political preferences. And these poor guys, the League of Nations commissioners, would do these interviews, and they'd have the name. They interviewed so many people. They'd have the name of somebody, and based on the first identity consideration, they would mark an A for Arab or a T for Turk. And then as the person started talking to them about the railroads and the trade and religion and politics, they'd have to cross through the A and put on a T, and sometimes they'd cross through the T and put an A back on, because they had this binary notion of identity and how identity would influence people without paying attention to the fact that there were more things that mattered than simply one's predominant first language. Another example, in 1936, the League of Nations was called on to figure out whether Antakya, Iskenderun area should be part of Turkey or Syria. I knew going into this that the League of Nations had created a plebiscite in which people had indicated whether they wanted to be attached to one country or the other. I figured that if I found out everything there was to know about this plebiscite, I would understand the predominant nationalism of the contested area. I began reading about plebiscites that the League of Nations had carried out in the interwar period, and I was surprised to find that there was no mention of the Sanjak plebiscite. I couldn't find one in the League archives either. Turks have been told since 1940 that the people of the Sanjak of Alexandretta Iskenderun, today called Hatay, had voted to become part of Turkey. They had not. Instead, the League of Nations created an autonomous province and prepared elections to the provincial assembly. The first step of elections was as far as the thing ever progressed, to registration by community. The assumption was that Turks would register as Turks, that Arabs would register as Arabs. There were 7 different categories in which one could register. Anyone, however, could register in any community he wished. Only men, of course, could register and vote, and seats in the assembly would be allocated in proportion to the number registered in each community. For those of you who are political scientists, I think this is the first example of a constitutional project. The archives are filled with examples of people deciding to register as one community or another. Nationalist leaders from Ankara and Damascus appeared in the contested province to convince people that they were either Turks or Arabs. Here's one story from the court records of the time. In the early afternoon of May 10th, 1938, a chauffeur named Saido sat chatting in front of a cafe in the town of Reyhanlı in the Sanjak of Alexandretta. Haydar Hasan Musto and a group of friends saw Saido, approached his table, and began screaming at him in this outside cafe. There were many witnesses called on to testify in the trial, and they described the scene as harsh words, blows, revolvers brandished in the air. When prosecutors questioned the witnesses, however, most were unable to recount what had been said, as Haydar insulted Saido's mother, demanded Saido declare himself to be an Arab, threatened to kill him if he claimed to be a Turk, and taunted him about the brimmed hat he was wearing, a symbol of Turkishness. The witnesses were unable to recount the argument about whether Saido should declare himself to be an Arab or a Turk because the argument had been taking place in Kurdish. Here's another. I forgot to put it on my thing. This one is about Yusuf. Yusuf was a fisherman in the coastal city of Alexandretta, Iskenderun, interrupted by a fellow named Nadim Ward and two other Arab nationalists sitting at Ali's Cafe on the morning of May 4th, 1938. A lot of this stuff happens in cafes. They demanded to know why Yusuf, an Arabic-speaking Alawite, was wearing a hat with a brim, a symbol of Kemal Ataturk's revolutionary Turkey. A poor man, Yusuf responded that he had no other head covering to wear, and one had to wear a head covering. Nadim Ward handed Yusuf 20 francs, told him to go buy himself a fez. In response, Yusuf ripped off the brimmed hat, threw it on the ground, stomped on it, went around the corner, and immediately purchased a fez from a nearby shop. As he was leaving the store, he encountered two Turkish nationalists who took his fez, crushed it on the ground, and demanded, "Come, show us who destroyed the hat." At which point there's this two groups in the street who fight each other. The point here is there are Turkish nationalists and there are Arab nationalists, and then there are men too poor to be able to buy whichever hat they feel like they need if they have that kind of desire to identify. But 5 minutes. Identities were fluid in this border area, as they had been in Mosul a decade earlier. Leaders in both contested zones insisted on collective affiliations, distributed flags and hats, set up cultural events and parades. The only way to acquire territory was by displaying nationalism. Just as an aside, in case you think that this is something that's distinctive in the interwar Middle East, I've discovered by reading historians of Europe that European identities were similarly fluid in border regions like Alsace and Bohemia. So Tara Zahra's work talks about how in the Bohemian borderlands, Czech and German schools vied for students for the various schools, and the nationalists insisted that they send students to only the Czech schools if they were Czech or the German schools if they were German, and the parents overwhelmingly chose schools based on who had better lunches and the desire to provide their children with bilingual education. So they'd move the children back and forth from one school to another. This was not some sort, what I've been talking about in the Middle East, of Middle Eastern perversion of a normal civilizational progress, but instead a common consequence of people living together over extended periods. European nationalism may have been an ideal type, but as far as Europeans concerned, it never existed anywhere in practice, the nation state as simply a nation state. So, in conclusion, nationalism is, after all, exclusionary by definition. Only some people can some people can define and belong to the nation, otherwise the nation has no meaning. Creating nation states and loyalties required establishing new national identities. Joseph Massad writes about this in Colonial Effects, among other places. People had to be convinced that residents of the new states were somehow a different nation than those in neighboring states. New flags, new anthems, new armies, new exclusionary histories, new mythologies of land, and new definitions of belonging. Drawing those borders created new fault lines in the Ummah. Just as the new nation state brought new national identities, it also established new obstacles. Since new neighboring others were by definition not us any longer, and could potentially any day become enemies, the region was laid open to the apparently essential need for the protection of great powers and superpowers against potentially hostile neighbors. What I want us to consider is that nationalism is not normative. Instead, it is a historical phenomenon that arose in Europe as a result of European historical contexts, was redefined as essential for higher level civilization, and imposed as a litmus test for all those who wanted to escape European domination. Nationalism has been on the wane now for a few decades, though how long is still open to dispute among historians who continue to love the notion of the nation and use it promiscuously in analyzing everyone's past. Many of my very distinguished colleagues this week have asked us to rethink paradigms, and I want to do the same here. For example, Professor Lombard insisted that the use of Western analytical categories takes both power and legitimacy away from Muslim understandings of their own texts and culture. I'm suggesting the same thing about nationalism. What if we narrate the struggles in the Arab world as about projects other than nationalism? Take them on their own terms as reflecting the broad variety of issues people are facing. They may have been struggles to reject occupation, to refuse colonial settlers, to seek domination, to maintain power, to demand economic survival, to insist on respect. If we no longer automatically try to associate all these risings with nationalism, how would our narrative of Arab history change? Here's another consequence. Professor Hashemi asked us to rethink sectarianism, arguing that the state manipulated it to maintain its own power. What happens to our narrative of the past if we look at nationalism in a similar framework? Whatever its origins, it is maintained and exacerbated to divide the region, to empower state leadership, and to facilitate outside intervention. Finally, I was struck when Professor Borat talked about how the Arab Spring fractured national religious communities, opening them to exploitation by governments seeking to maintain power. I'm wondering if that very fracturing could provide one solution to this question of the fault lines and their perils. Shattering the national and sectarian narratives could provide opportunities. When I first start teaching students in courses on nationalism, I go to the board and ask them to tell me who they are. And their identities are myriad. They have so many identities. If we take apart our identities and we don't privilege one above the other, if we recognize our own multiple simultaneous identities, I'm wondering about the possibility of finding more commonalities among the fragments. We have organizations where grandmothers from across borders get together to try to enforce human rights. What about the prospect of having, we already have artists and painters in various areas. Think about the very, very varied kinds of identities that we all have. And if we get rid of the tribalism that comes from nationalism or insisting on only one identity, I'm wondering if that would be one possibility for ending the kinds of crises that that Europeans brought us when they brought us nationalism.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheilds. Our next talk is somewhere in here. It's entitled Islamic Multiculturalism and Muslim Nationalism in Turkey. And I believe there should be a PowerPoint presentation.
I am grateful to the organizers for this invitation to publish, to present my work, which combines two already published articles on Islamic multiculturalism in Turkey and Muslim nationalism in Turkey, Algeria, and Pakistan, with some extensions for this conference. But then I was told that there was going to be a remote control so that I can do my presentation. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, there we go. Okay, so and I'll also have to face over there. First, in the first two slides, I want to. First of all, it's great to be following Dr. Kanjwal and Sheilds because their presentations. I think could very well be linked up with the arguments found in my presentation. First of all, a brief, what I would call a historical structural background. Is there no way to see the slides here as well? Because it's a little bit, is there, can't I see the slides in the screen? No? Okay. Then I will do it like this. First of all, it's important to realize that, okay, let's do this. I'll open up from my cell phone. Okay, so let's start again. In Turkey, but also in many Muslim societies today, we have a transition historically from Islamic empires with multi-religious populations, Christians and Hindus and Jews and Sikhs and so on and so forth, which were transformed into secular nation states with mono-religious Muslim populations, which, especially from a Western European Catholic perspective, let's say, seems very paradoxical given the Western Christian secular history, because Islamic past was much more religiously diverse than the secular nationalist present in Turkey, but also in Algeria, in Pakistan, and in many other major, I hesitate to say all, but in many of the major Muslim nation states. That paradox is inexplicable if we do not go into the origins of Muslim nationalism in these major polities, as well as the background against which they mobilized. Therefore, Islamic multiculturalism is inspired and justified by this historical legacy of pre-nationalist Islamic diversity in Turkey and elsewhere, as well as primary religious sources such as the Quran. But why? Why did this transition occur, especially in some of the most paradigmatic cases of Muslim nation-state building, such as Turkey, Pakistan, and Algeria? Because it was, as discussed in great detail actually, that Muslims were excluded on the basis of their religious identity by European empires, expanding European empires, whether it is the Russian Empire or British colonial rule after the 1857 rebellion especially, or French settler colonialism in Algeria, right? I mean, the primary reason why 90% of Algerians who were Muslim, Berber, or Arab were denied citizenship, unlike the Jewish, indigenous Jewish, and French settler colonial Christians, is because of their religion, despite the fact that later Muslim nationalist leaders such as Farhad Abbas and Ahmed bin Bella were very much in favor of assimilation, and they tried very hard to gain a measure of equality. It is the denial of equality to Indian Muslim, denial of equality to Algerian Muslim majority, and the denial of equality to the retreating Muslim populations left over by the Ottoman Empire through ethnic cleansings and deportations that then provoked a mobilization on the basis of that religious identity, that is Islam and Muslim identity, by leaders who themselves, as we will see in a moment, were not necessarily in favor of religious state formation. So the fundamental contradiction, and from there I will strictly move to Turkey alone. These three states were founded on the basis of an Islamic mobilization against non-Muslim opponents. And when you look at all the, again, tracks of the nationalist literature, it's invariably defined as a jihad, and the fighters is mujahids. In Algeria, in British India, in Turkey, for sure, the Turkish war, the National War of Independence, which is not called Turkish War of Independence at the time. It's just the national struggle, and that national millet originally at that time means religious community, right? It's the Milli struggle, not a Turkic or Turkish struggle at the time. And that is very much the pattern also in these other instances. But having successfully defeated these non-Muslim opponents, their political elites chose a secular and monolingual nation-state model, which they thought would maximize their national security and status. Now, this is the fateful contradiction, the fateful choice, because following a avowedly religious mobilization on the basis of one religious identity and religious rhetoric in Turkey in 1920-21, in India and in Algeria, the choice of a very secular nation-building model that is also monolingual, modern standard Turkish, Urdu, as it was brilliantly explained, and Algerian Arabic and not Berber, led to recurrent challenges of increasing magnitude to the state in the form of Islamic and ethnic minority mobilizations since the founding of the state to the present day. Right? Mass Islamic movements in Turkey, Pakistan, and Algeria, but also, to give just one example from each, Kurdish Zaza, ethnic minority mobilization in Turkey, Bengali, Baluchi, Sindhi mobilizations, and Berber mobilization in Algeria. So these steps, these first three critical steps, mobilization and violent fighting to get independence against a non-Muslim opponent, is critical, because whom you fight against defines the nation, which is very different from Levantine Arab nationalism. Right? So Syrian, Lebanese, Sharif Hussein revolted against the Muslim state. And George Antonius was given as an example, wonderful example. George Antonius, Michel Aflaq. You can find many Christian Levantine Arab nationalists, but it's almost impossible to find the equivalent. It almost sounds impossible to find Christian Turkish nationalists of the 1920s, or and so on and so forth. Because the critical independence mobilization and war was waged against opponents that were defined by their religious difference. European, Christian, or Hindu majority, non-Muslim rivals. I'm sorry, I'm trying to coordinate the two because I can't see that there. Okay, let's switch to this again. Okay, which brings me to actually the puzzle that I'd like to address today. Two puzzles that can be answered only if we give a more accurate account of why Turkey undertook the Kurdish opening. I mentioned the previous story because it's the background against which Islamic multiculturalism and the openings, the reforms towards Kurds, Alevis, Armenians, Zaza, Arabs of the last 10 years unfolded. It's impossible to understand them fully without knowing the founding of the state and its ethnic and Islamic contradictions first. The first puzzle of two is the puzzle of Kurdish, Alevi, and Armenian reforms. Reforms for Kurds, Alevis, and Armenians in Turkey and their discontents. Kurdish language and even ethnonym was criminalized in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Turkey, but also following the 1960 military coup, 1970 military coup, 1980-83 military dictatorship. Even a minister in the cabinet served time in prison for stating that there are Kurds, just the very ethnonym Kurds were forbidden. So against this background of almost 80 years of soft and hard criminalization and prohibition on ethnic identities, such as Kurdish and Zaza, it is indeed tremendous change of ethnic policy that in 2004, Turkish public broadcaster, TRT, began broadcasting Arabic, Bosniak, Circassian, Kurdish, and Zaza. Just 5 years later, in 2009, Turkey opened an entire public TV channel, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, in Kurdish, TRT Kurdi, in which I've appeared many times as dubbed. I don't speak Kurdish. It has to be simultaneously translated. Followed by TRT Arabi, much more recently. Followed by, in 2013, the abolishing of the Turkish Pledge of Allegiance, which said the famous words of Atatürk, how happy is the one who says I'm a Turk, I'm proud to be Turkish. This was abolished in 2013, which was protested by many minorities. And Kurdish and Zaza and Circassian dialects were offered as elective language courses in all public middle and high schools. And tens of thousands of children have chosen, Kurdish is the most popular one, followed by Zaza, Kurdish language in Turkish public schools since 2013, since 2012-2013 academic year. Why? So all of these reforms are together known colloquially in Turkish as the Kurdish opening, but as you can see, it's actually not just Kurdish opening, it's ethnic diversity opening to Zazas, to Arabs, to Circassians, to Laz and Georgians, all of these various ethnic groups. Why? I'll just gloss over, I'll just say that there has always been, there has also been an Alevi opening almost coinciding with that. A non-Sunni interpretation or form of Islam, which found more and more space in the Turkish compulsory religious education textbooks, more or less starting at the same time under also AK Party governments. All of these are happening under AK Party governments since then, followed by the Armenian opening, where then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan offered his condolences for the victims, Armenian victims of 1915 and their suffering, which was seen as a watershed. Why? Why? And at the same time that these triple, quadruple, you can multiply it, openings were happening in the last decade, some Kurdish, some Alevi, some Armenian organizations not only did not support, they even opposed these reforms. Why? This is an incredible puzzle. We can't really answer that puzzle if we don't first correct a major misunderstanding, in my opinion, about the causes of the Kurdish opening themselves. What you find in the scholarly literature, overwhelming majority of the scholarly literature, is one of three views. That AK Party did this because of electoral incentives to get votes. But then again, it doesn't make much sense since AK Party gets minuscule, marginal Alevi vote. Of almost 300 members in the parliament, one or none, debatably, is of Alevi origin. That vote percentage is so small, especially if you consider the amount of backlash such an Alevi opening could generate from the 80% Sunni majority. And even more so, Armenian voters altogether make up maybe 0.2% of the population. If they all concentrate in one district, maybe they could elect one member out of 600 in the national parliament. So electoral incentives really do not make any sense in the case of Armenian or Alevi openings to begin with. Sorry, I'm trying to catch up as I said. Sorry. And European Union pressure, that is extremely common in the articles and books you find in the literature. But the most tremendous reforms happened between 2009, establishing of TRT Kurdi and offering Kurdish, Zaza, and other languages in public school system in 2012, 2013, removing Pledge of Allegiance along with the headscarf ban and restrictions on Islamic observance in the end of 2013, when international observers were downgrading Turkey's democracy scores, and European Union have frozen Turkey's accession talks in 2005. So all of these reforms happening 8 years after European Union froze negotiations with Turkey do not make any sense from a chronological perspective that this would be some kind of result of EU pressure, and EU did not reward any of these reforms in any way by, as I've said, on the contrary, relations were getting worse. So it just doesn't make sense chronologically. Same thing with the PKK explanation, which is extremely common. These reforms are happening at a time when PKK is militarily defeated. Its leader has been in jail for over a decade. Even its electoral popularity dips in 2007, 2009, its political wing. So again, there is no, if it was some sort of pressure, that would have been in the mid-1990s at the latest. So all of these explanations do not make sense. What I think makes sense, and what I have argued, as you can see from the title, is that Islamic multiculturalism was the main motivation, cause, and limitation of Turkey's reforms for Kurds, Alevis, and Armenians. This explains their actors, their timing, and also why some Kurds, Alevis, Armenians supported it, and some Kurds, Alevis, and Armenians opposed it. Those who found themselves excluded by an Islamic religious framing of diversity opposed it. What is Islamic multiculturalism? So now in these two kind of, not penultimate, but almost penultimate slides, I have very long, I have very long quotations from the articles directly. I defined it for the purposes, this is more like the trailer than the real feature movie. So if you can, if you are interested about any aspect of it, you can ask me in Q&A. I'll try to read it from here. Islamic multiculturalism refers to the recognition and the fair treatment of ethnic and religious diversity based on, in parentheses, the interpretation of the Quran, the practice of the Prophet, and the political and religious tradition that succeeded them. And I draw this from the examples that political actors themselves cite as the motivation for their reforms, right? Including the leaders of AK Party, the government party. The Quranic verse, and I quote, "And of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors." That's Surah Ar-Rum 22. Is often cited as an injunction against any effort to eliminate ethno-racial diversity among people against their will, including genocide, racism, or forceful assimilation, all of which accompanied modern nationalism, as you know. So in a way, it's used as a condemnation of modern nationalism, even in its softer versions, which would not be genocide, but forceful assimilation. The Prophet's farewell sermon, where he said that, and quote, and this is probably the most popular quotation used to justify and support the openings in various electoral and other electoral rallies and forums, is then I quote, "An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, or nor a non-Arab has any superiority over Arab. Also a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over a white," unquote, is another very popular reference point. The key here is that within Turkish party politics, flanked by Kemalist secularist nationalism, Turkic ethnic nationalism, Nationalist Action Party, Kurdish socialist movement attached to the PKK, this vision is by far the more open to multi-ethnic and multi-religious diversity than, the 2-3 major alternative political forces. And that's why it could be successful politically in making this possible. Because the key is not even to make the reforms for Kurds, Zazas, Arabs, Circassians, Alevis, or Armenians. The key is not to lose power due to a backlash from the Turkish-speaking Sunni majority as a result of these reforms, right? How do you convince a society that is 70–80% Turkish-speaking and Sunni majority to accept these reforms? References to Islam as the justification for overcoming, transcending ethno-national distinctions has been the most useful one. And I'll only make one quote, lengthy quote from President Erdogan's campaign speech, at that time Prime Minister, in 2011 general election in the largest Kurdish province, Diyarbakir, where he emphasized that, and these are all direct quotes, and you can find them there, Diyarbakir is home to 41 companions, Sahabe of the Prophet. He mentioned it has been conquered earlier than almost any province within Turkey by the Islamic armies. He elevates Diyarbakir to a religious stature only third to Mecca and Medina because of having the largest number of companions of the Prophet located in the city. And then Erdogan related his story of his visit to Kurdish Salahuddin Eyyubi's tomb in Damascus, and he says, again, this is extremely common from all of his speeches, we are all grandchildren of Salahuddin Eyyubi. We are the grandchildren of the soldiers who conquered Jerusalem in Saladin's army, whether they were Turkish, Kurdish, Arab, Circassian, Zaza, or Roma Sinti. We love the created because of the creator, in the words of Sufi mystic Yunus. It is significant observation that all the references mentioned above are to pre-Ottoman history. Ayyubids, Umayyads. So this is not neo-Ottomanism by any stretch. It is well earlier pre-Islamic multiculturalism. This also explains why, I will only say in one sentence, that while Islamic multiculturalism is more open to religious diversity, for example, justifying Armenian opening, Jewish opening, restoration of synagogues as people of the book, which is again first time in 80 years that synagogues and big Armenian churches are being restored, reopened, rebuilt in Turkey, justifying them with reference to Islamic history and Islamic textual sources, whereas Muslim nationalism is much more defensive. And that's why that becomes highlighted whenever the fear of Turkey under attack or Muslim under attack becomes, and that has become, especially in the last 2-3 years, the more predominant theme. That is more open to intra-Muslim, Kurdish, Zaza, Circassian diversity, not so much to inter-religious, but both of them are intertwined. I don't have any time to talk about the rest, unfortunately. Let me leave you with a comparative question. Is this a cross-national pattern? Right? Are Islamic political movements in Indonesia, Pakistan, Algeria, Senegal, and elsewhere also more open to ethnic and linguistic diversity than their secularist rivals? It is not a coincidence that AK Party is the only mainstream party that receives millions of Kurdish votes, whereas Kemalist CHP doesn't win a single Kurdish province, and the Turkish nationalist MHP never wins a Kurdish province either. But is this a cross-national pattern, or is it very specific to Turkey alone? Yeah. Please email any comments and questions to my email addresses, and the sources for both of the questions, quotations are from my articles, Religion and Nationalism in Turkey, Algeria, Pakistan, and One Nation Under Allah, Islamic Multiculturalism and Muslim Nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you for all of these really fantastic contributions that I think have raised a number of really important questions. But now is an opportunity to open it up to some discussion. So if we have some questions, perhaps we can collect some from the audience. Yes, we have right here. Professor Masad.
Good morning. Thank you all. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you all for these 3 very exciting papers. My question actually has to do with a theme that you all touched on, which is multiculturalism or diversity. As we know, these are sort of liberal American themes in many ways that have developed in the last maybe 4 to 5 decades in a very racialized and racist United States. And as many critics have tried to show, multiculturalism in the US is actually the new racism, right? In many ways, multiculturalism is the way sort of white liberals organize all other communities in relation to themselves while maintaining them in an inferior position with whiteness as the center. So in large measure, of course, the new name of the US policy of diversity just continues this liberal imperialist notion of diversity wherein everyone is diverse in relation to whiteness, which remains the center. So in many ways, there has been a huge amount of criticism of these liberal notions that are just seen as a continuation of a racist and a monoculturalist imposition on the rest of the world, beautified cosmetically with terms like multicultural and diverse. All of you referred to pre-modern sort of arrangements of communities, yet you still refer to them as multicultural. As we know, the term culture begins to acquire this meaning only in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. So perhaps you're referring to multilinguistic or multilingual groups, and perhaps also multi-faith groups in that sense. But also, so in these possible examples, how, in one way, as perhaps Professor Sheilds has mentioned, such an arrangement existed in relation to empires that were not nationally defined, and therefore there was no central identity to the empire outside of the system of governance, and therefore there was a possibility, perhaps not of equality, but of tolerance of difference in some way. I'm not sure how this might apply to our national sort of nationally defined contours today after 200 years of nationalism around the world. And perhaps this also, it touches both on Dr. Kanjwal's notion of how Muslim nation states can be more diverse or multicultural, and can they escape this US conundrum, and Professor Akturk's notion of Islamic multiculturalism today. Could perhaps the resistance to this be in relation to the fact that all this multiculturalism or multilingual tolerance, that it's always related to a centralized Turkish notion that still defines them as satellites of itself rather than equivalent to it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The Professor Ishaq.
Yeah. I'm kind of with a little bit of trepidation that I raise my question. But before my question, I want to say that I very much appreciated all three panelists. And in fact, at the back of my head, oh gosh, I really must get copies of their papers. My question is a bit of a larger one, although it was triggered by the last speaker, who gave me kind of new insights into how contemporary Turkey is dealing with the question of diverse ways in which communities self-identify, whether it is Armenian or Kurd or Alavis or whatever. I'm kind of, well, I'm not a great fan of, I'm a gentle skeptic of state-driven ideological initiatives. And that includes the current kind of project that at a superficial level Turkey seems to be engaged in. And at the same time, I'm deeply appreciative when states or governments take cognizance of the cultural and the reservoirs of people and don't walk over it, but try to reconstruct those societies, whether you want to call them nations or not, try to reconstruct and rebuild and develop those societies, drawing on the deeper reservoirs. And in this particular case, the reservoirs of religion, of culture and tradition, I'm appreciative of that. I was particularly fascinated by the fact that this reservoir is not a narrow Turkic Ottoman project. So I was excited to learn about that. But the one thing at the back of my mind was, sorry, I'm belaboring the point. I'll get to the point I'll finish in about 30 seconds or 60, in 60 seconds. The one thing that at the back of my mind was, okay, so I'm listening to this narrative, and I'm really kind of welcoming listening to it, but is there any space for a counter-narrative? Now, I'm not suggesting that at a conference that deals with, say, gender justice in Islam, that you must have a voice there that explains why women at the proper time deserve a good beating, because you must have alternative voices. I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that at a conference like this we require a pro-imperialist voice to balance the other voices. But I am saying, is there space in this kind of facilities for an alternative kind of voice to the one that I appreciated and valued very much from the third speaker? It's not a question addressed to any of the speakers. It's a thought which, if the convener of the conference has the stomach for it, may want to address when he comes and thanks people. Thank you very much, and sorry for belaboring my point.
Any questions here? Right there. Yeah. And we'll try to keep them short so we can get more questions.
For sure. This is Fahad Shahzad. I am a student at Marmara University. My first question is to Dr. Kanjwal. You mentioned the rising Kashmiri nationalist identity in the Kashmir, but when I see in the media, I'm a student of the media, when I see over there when some Kashmiri get murdered by Indian army, the guy get buried in the Pakistani flag. To irritate Indian army, they draw Pakistani flag on the cow because it's a sacred animal for the Indians. So how do you see this phenomena? And the second to Dr. Sarah, I really enjoyed your presentation. The question is it having some identity, nationalism or any other, the need of the society, or it is the elite of the society who defines and then impose it? I hope the question is clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Right there.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum, and I want to thank the speakers. I want to give voice to what Dr. Ishaq said. They were all three were very, very interesting. I wanted to also take off or sort of bootstrap onto the previous question for Dr. Sarah, and that is this idea of a singular identity. Where did that come from? Among the Europeans, where did it come from? And I'm asking specifically if you think it was part of an agenda. So we're seeing this idea of terrorism, being developed in the West and being used for a number of reasons, where we don't really have a definition in any sense of the, scholarly term for what terrorist might be. So it's more of a political agenda than it is a phenomenon. And I'm wondering if this idea of, forcing people or trying to impose identity or singular identity is part of an agenda, of a political agenda.
Thank you. And we have a question in the front here, in the front row.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Well, for Dr. Shield, I really appreciate your presentation. I appreciate all presentations, but especially for Dr. Shield. There are a few points perhaps that may support that ideas. One of them is the migration of many Turks from Hatay to Damascus and Aleppo at the time of 1938. And another thing probably also that explains the non-nationalist motivation is the great support that the struggle against the French colonialist that was given by Akturk government itself in Syria to the Syrian strugglers. Now the question to Dr. Shield is, does the Arab Spring reveal a different kind of motivation, a different kind of maybe foundation of the community or the individual understanding of Arabs in the Arab Spring. And that could also, with it, can you explain the mass immigration or migration rather that we had in, especially from Egypt, from Syria, from Iraq, and from Jordan also, to some other countries, wherever they are, these other countries, this mass migration. Can it be explained by maybe different kind of ideas and motivations other than the nationalism or nationalist movement, or even the religious motivation? I mean, both for Arab Spring and for the Arab migration. I think we need some explanation for these. For Dr. Sener, I have one very small point that the first assumption that Dr. Sener made about the transformation into state, national state systems with the monotheistic religion, one religion for each. I think probably the examples he took may not be revealing the reality. Pakistan and Turkey have special history that create probably that kind of concept, but Algeria definitely, in the Algerian culture over the last 2 centuries at least, being Christian or Jews was defined as being colonialist. So it wasn't an issue of monotheistic religion, rather it was an issue of struggle against colonialists. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a question from this side of the room.
Sorry, can I start? I got the microphone.
Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hey, my name is Ahmed, and my question is going to be for Dr. Sheilds. It's going to be a bit functional, but simple. You have mentioned about the European phenomenon in those ages and the French Revolution, and it's totally agreed that French Revolution is the breaking point of the concept of nationalism. And therefore, many of states, multicultural states, multinational states such as Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary are influenced that. And also, once upon a time, my history teacher said that Ottoman Empire was like a flower, and the minorities were their like leaves in a flower. And after nationalism and after French Revolution influenced the world and influenced those multinational states, the leaves of the flower fell off one by one. And my question is, as I said, it's kind of a bit functional, but I've been wondering about this. If French Revolution and its versions in those days, in those ages, were not materialized, were not occurred, would we have been still talking and considering upon the concept of nationalism, or is this an unescapable ending for us? Thank you.
Thank you. And the next one is here.
Thank you for those great lectures. My question to Professor Sarah, I would like to hear more about using projects, not nationalists, as yes, I'm here. For building identities. You speak about using projects, not nationalism, for building identities in the Middle East. I would like to elaborate this idea. How can we rethink about, rewrite history, or think about identities based on projects, no nationalism?
Any other questions on this side? Here. Okay, we'll go here.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentations. I have a question to Dr. Sener. Multiculturalism was born as a constructive critique of Orthodox liberalism failure, or rather lacking in accommodating diversity in the Western democracies in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So I was wondering, what would be the benefits or limitations of using multiculturalism in understanding the issues of accommodation of diversity and pluralism in the Muslim majority contexts? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have a question here. Yes.
Thank you for knowledge we share with you. And I want to ask a question to Dr. Sener. What does it mean, Islamic nationalism? We know Ummah, but I couldn't understand Islamic nationalism. And as you know, we struggled during 20th century against direct colonialization. But now, starting from 20th century, we are trying to decolonize our mind, because Western concepts are colonizing our mind. And it is not possible to bring Islam and nationalism together. I couldn't understand this. Yeah.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. This problem of identity is remain unresolved until now, all over the world. Islamists in every member countries or every countries, they're struggling whether should they call themselves Islamist nationalists or Islamist multinationalists. If they claim to be nationalists, they claim they are blame that they are not, they don't have that vision of Ummah of Islam. If they claim that they are more open to the Ummah and more multinational, they called anti-nationalists. So this problem remains unresolved. If you could claim this.
Question from here.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask a simple question. I'm wondering personally why, I mean, as human beings, we cannot unify under, universal ideals. Does it, cognitive bias because we cannot categorize universal? Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll turn it over to our speakers. I wanted to just throw a couple of ideas out as well. I mean, I think one of them that reflects maybe some of the last questions has to do with this notion of Islamic exceptionalism when dealing with nationalism. And so I think running through all of the presentations was a sense that the tensions that actually existed in early nationalist movements was one that, for the most part, included many different factors and categories that were not necessarily just religiously based. In fact, questions of language and ethnicity and several other kinds of, even just geography and territory had a lot to do with the tensions with many of these early movements that later came to be seen as nationalist. But most of the narrative that comes down to us, especially perhaps as a result of recent kind of political history and kind of post-imperial history, has to do with the fact that Islam was seen as the barrier to nationalism. And so sort of how can we understand that now, especially in light of this idea that there is a nationalistic component perhaps to the way that Islamic political organization has taken root. I think South Asia is usually used as kind of the preeminent example of that, given the case of Pakistan, but not necessarily as an exceptional one, right? Because we see the same kinds of currents and forces taking place in the Arab world and in Turkey as well, as we've heard. Another question, I think more specifically perhaps to Professor Akturk, has to do with this idea that the Islamic multiculturalism that you discussed, in some ways, I mean, is it dangerous to try to harken back to this, to kind of what the late Ottoman era looked like, by sort of recalling the ways in which, this diversity was sort of being celebrated, this kind of pluralistic environment, in a way that, I mean, what is the actual impact under the kind of current Republican model, under the nation state, of having these civil rights or cultural rights, perhaps, of minority groups? How does that actually translate into some of the real, perhaps, political and economic grievances that exist on the part of these groups? I mean, what is the significance of having, your own media channels or your own parallel education or curriculum when there are kind of these other broader considerations to be made, and can those other issues be reconciled through this kind of path that you've described? And whether this is really a product of a political project on the part of a party, or whether you see this as really a structural transformation that's happening systemically within the actual state structures and also, of course, across society. And I know you have a lot on your plate, so I'll turn it over first to Professor Kanjwal.
Okay, so I'll answer the question that was directly addressed to me. So yes, you make a really important point, and one of the things that I do want to mention, maybe we do then need to get out of the category of nationalism, is, as I mentioned, there is an uneasy relationship between Kashmiri nationalism and Pakistan nationalism, but I wouldn't say that there's like a very solid boundary. It's actually quite fluid, and at different moments it kind of emerges together. So the example that you mentioned, where after martyrs are killed, these are rebels fighting for the Hizbul Mujahideen, which is a pro-Pakistan organization, against the Indian state. Their bodies are buried in Pakistan flags. Another example is, so when there are protests, street protests between the boys and the Indian army, one sort of interesting picture that was floating around is of a cow, who is obviously very important symbolically for Hindus and for Indians. Someone drew a Pakistani flag on the cow because the threat, I mean, when Indians see the Pakistani flag, that's obviously is not going to make them happy, but then if they see it on a cow, like, are they going to kill the cow or what? So that was the kind of taunt that was raised. There's also been some recent instances of ISIS flags actually being raised as well. And I mean, the ISIS flag situation is different from the pro-Pakistan nationalism, and most people in Kashmir will say that it's not that Kashmiris have adopted ISIS ideology, far from that, but rather it's a way to taunt the Indian soldiers or taunt the Indian army that are in their neighborhoods, just to kind of assert that ideology to scare them off or to threaten them. And so I think it's not necessarily the same way in which the Pakistani nationalism emerges, because there is a strong element of Pakistani nationalism in Kashmir, and this could be as a result of many things. One is that there are obviously the leadership is pro-Pakistan for the most part. The Hurriyat leadership is pro-Pakistan. They're answering primarily to Pakistan. And because the plebiscite and the dimensions of the conflict have only really made it so that Pakistan and India are the only viable options, independence is something that a number of Kashmiris have themselves raised, whether leaders or activists, but it's not necessarily gained much international relevance. And even the question of plebiscite has been rendered obsolete. So I think Kashmiri nationalists are still trying to figure out, like, what is our relationship to Pakistan? You know, all of these things are still quite fluid. And that's why, again, this concept of nationalism isn't necessarily the most productive one when thinking of a place like Kashmir, where there's so many different interests in play and so many different agencies as well. And some things that we don't necessarily think about is in conflict societies, there are so many agencies at play. Some people are saying that the boys that are raising the ISIS flags are actually sponsored by India to show to the international community that Kashmiris are increasingly becoming radicalized, which then undermines the movement altogether. So it's really hard to see and figure out exactly what's going on, who's behind what, and that makes people's aspirations also very difficult and hard to understand at different points.
Thank you for the insightful and thought-provoking questions, and now I get to try to answer them. For Professor Masad, if you had asked me 2 years ago about multiculturalism, I would have had a different answer, I suspect. We live in a time in Trump's America where multiculturalism is in competition with a white nationalism that's venomous. And so multiculturalism seems the better of two options. On the other hand, it's rather amazing that Trump can make it look good. The big problem with multiculturalism and diversity as the liberal project is that it's a liberal project. When I go to diversity training, I'm asked to close my eyes and imagine a society where black people and white people can get along. And as historian, particularly economic historian, I come away furious every time because it's not about our feelings. It's about centuries of institutionalized racism and the inability of African Americans to own property that still continues. It's about nobody supporting the Black Lives Matter, young black men and women being killed by police without any kind of trial. We don't have a diverse multicultural society. What we have is an extremely racist society that's based on white power. And before Trump was in power, it was less obvious, but it still existed. I'm sure that is not a helpful answer. I am an economic historian, and when people ask me about do leaders impose national identity and why, I tend to look first toward power and social economic structures. When Bismarck, Mazzini, Garibaldi wanted to bring together Germany and the Italian states, they didn't do it because they were ideologues. They did it because there's a tremendous amount of economic resources throughout the states that they were trying to create. They wanted power over a bigger area, more resources. Nationalism is a terrific way to do that. And it's also a wonderful way. 19th century is full of wars. How do you get people to fight for you? You do it by claiming that they have a stake in the society. Even if they don't, even if they're badly paid workers who are not allowed to unionize, even if they can barely make a living, even if their sons are being taken away to do various kinds of labor, if you convince them that they are German, Italian, French, then the need for economic change is less pressing. Does the Arab Spring reveal a different kind of motivation? I'd actually argue that it reveals a very similar kind of motivation. Remember that Tahrir Square begins after the big labor strikes throughout Egypt. In the West, we really love the impression of all of these people, a multicultural Tahrir Square. It really is beautiful. And it was fairly nonviolent, at least as far as the protesters were concerned. But it began with some people who were furious about economic conditions and the way they were treated in industry, and about the incredible human rights violations. And the same is true in Syria. I'm not sure how we could make those conflicts out to be nationalist. They weren't about creating an Egypt. They were about redressing really serious economic, social, human rights issues, power structures that existed in place where people tried to overthrow governments. Mass migrations, I feel like I keep saying the same thing. It's really looking at mass migrations, regardless of what the Israeli government said after 1948, Palestinians didn't leave for a better life. They left because they were thrown out. Mass migrations, people don't voluntarily leave their homes if they can survive in them. People leave, and I feel like I'm talking to a lot of people who I've known to be migrants here. My guess is that you didn't suddenly become Turkish nationalists and come to Istanbul to study. It's important to take apart the nationalist narrative so that we can actually look at what people are doing and what they need and what they're protesting. I think there were two more questions. Do I have time if I do them fast? Okay. I love the idea of the leaves falling off of the flowers. We're talking about here the end of empires, the end of large multinational, multicultural, multilinguistic. We're talking about big spaces where there were people who did all kinds of things in them. The leaves didn't fall off the flowers. The leaves were forcibly removed. And I think that historians need to pay attention to the process by which massacres and genocide, ethnic cleansing take place. It would be really nice to think that somehow or other there was something that happened and people went away. Armenians vanished, the Greeks left, somehow the Turks in Thessaloniki decided that they didn't want to be there anymore. The Palestinians somehow decided that they liked Jordan better. That stuff didn't happen. Leaves don't fall off unless there's some major, major problem with the plant. And finally, I loved Emre's question about universal identity. You're sort of assuming that people are inherently tribalist. But what historians say is that our collective identities change over time. They change from the ancient period to the modern, to the medieval period, to the early modern period, to the modern period. People identify collectively based on different kinds of criteria. Historians have decided that for the last 200 years, people have been nations. And some historians claim that people have been, or non-historians, popular writers, claim that people have been nations since the beginning of time. But there are lots of other kinds of identities that aren't as exclusionary, that other people can come to. One of the problems with nations is that they draw a bright line, and there are insiders and outsiders. And there are other kinds of identities that people don't have to be born into, that they can connect with, whether that's religion or class or whatever. The big problem with nationalism is that it really gets rid of all social structuring of class. And that's one of the big advantages of it. But it's also one of the things that makes it possible. I don't want to go back to workers of the world unite, sort of let's get all the workers together everywhere speaking different languages. What I'm suggesting is that that was one way to structure belonging. And what I'm hoping is that the people that I'm looking at now, the next generation, can come up with new ways of structuring belonging that are more inclusive and that somehow manage to take on some of these huge power differentials that nationalism serves.
Thank you very much for all of these thought-provoking questions and comments. I'll answer them in the order that I received them, and they follow very well, actually. So I think it will make more and more sense, and by the end, maybe I won't even need to answer the later questions. To start with Dr. Masad's question, I am trying to provincialize Western liberal multiculturalism. That is why I put the suffix Islamic. In the paper, you would see that I also say Socialist Soviet, which is an even earlier version. I want to present I mean, in this case, to a scholarly audience that there was, for example, as Terry Martin titles his book about Stalin, the first affirmative action empire. You know, militant atheist, so crushing religion altogether in a very brutal way, but allowing multi-ethnic diversity and language. Socialist, Bolshevik in content, but national ethnic in form. That was a multiculturalism before Kimlicka came around 50, 60 years ago. But it's a very different type of multiculturalism. So is the Islamic one. So, and I'll come back to the second comment too, but it is emphasized in the abstract, in the title, in the last slide, that it also incorporates some conservative Kurds, you know, religious Kurds and Alevi and Armenian, and excludes some socialist, atheist, agnostic. So in each version of multiculturalism, whether it's Western liberal, Soviet socialist, totalitarian, or Islamic, there are those who are included, but others who are excluded. So it's, I mean, you know, this is politics and comparative politics. That's how I see it. It does relate to the second question in a big way. And I want to provincialize this especially because Western Europe comes from a very historically unprecedented religious sectarian homogeneity. By 1526, after the expulsion of the last Muslims in Aragon, there was no place in Portugal, Spain, France, England where one could be publicly Muslim or Jewish. Right? There is no other geopolitical region of significance in the world up until that point that was so homogeneous religiously and ethnically. So against that background, Kimlickas and, you know, Canadian and Australian scholars are developing a liberal multiculturalism. Very different from the Soviet socialist experience and also different from Islamic experience. Dr. Esak's comments, thank you for asking it, despite your unease, because it gives me an opportunity. This, what I presented, is the counter-narrative in scholarship. The hegemonic narrative about Kurdish opening, Zaza opening, Arabic opening is that it's the Western European enlightened bureaucrats who would impose it, of course, upon Oriental despots and governments to do something good. When I used the word Islamic multiculturalism for the first time at a presentation at Columbia almost a decade ago, some, again, unidentified person from the audience said, Islamic multiculturalism, isn't that an oxymoron? Because nothing good, certainly not a multiculturalist reform supporting diversity, could ever come out of something Islamic. It must be either, European Union or some other external force that compels, Muslim majority democracy to do a progressive reform. That's why I thought this was the counter-narrative. If you think about the counter-narrative, not in the scholarship, but in the public domain, New York Times, Washington Post, there the counter-narrative, that is the hegemonic narrative about a socialist Bolshevik oasis in the east of Euphrates under the leadership of the PYD. I disagree with that, but that is the hegemonic, not the counter, but the hegemonic narrative in the Anglo-sphere. Media, is that you have what I would call, because that ties with Dr. Mesad's question, a version of Soviet socialist multiculturalist project, very irreligious but multi-ethnic, under protection of American Air Force, financed by Saudi Arabia. You have a multi-ethnic socialist state in Kamışlı and Haseke and elsewhere. Now, that's a different version. Yes, that's also multi-ethnic, and it is in my paper, it was in the last slide, that people who sympathize with that, what I would consider, because it's not a, it didn't emerge through democracy, it emerged through US Air Force and foreign fighters, but I would say those people who sympathize with that vision feel excluded by a multiculturalist vision that has too much religion in it. And I'll send you the paper, but all the debates that I cite are intra-Kurdish, intra-Armenian, intra-Alevi. Some Kurds who argue with other Kurds, some Alevis who argue with other Alevis, some Armenians in the parliament arguing with some other Armenians in the parliament, whether this is a vision that now is more inclusive or more exclusive. My conclusion was that it is more inclusive in comparative historical perspective against what came before, because it excluded maybe half, maybe less, maybe more, the more religious conservative segments of these populations, but it's not 100% exclusive. That has to come through something else, if it ever comes. So I thought both in scholarship and in public domain, what you just heard would be counter-narrative to a hegemonic narrative of Western enlightened liberalism or US-supported multiculturalism in the Middle East. I'm going to jump over the other aspects of your question, unfortunately. I couldn't agree more with the comment about Algeria. What I found extremely interesting in the Turkish, Pakistani, and Algerian cases that within a year of independence in all three of them, millions of non-Muslims left the territories. They were forcefully exchanged in the case of Greek Muslims expelled from Greece and Anatolian Christians expelled from Turkey in the Indian partition, and the indigenous, not colonial, but indigenous Jewish Algerians and French, Italian, etc., Catholic settlers who left for mainland France the year after, within a year after Algeria became independent. That actually I took as a verification that there is something very common about these three particular Muslim nation states, which I took care not to call Islamic but Muslim, because it goes against the historical pattern of not having a Muslim-only polity in Islamic history. So that is what nationalism introduces, a Muslim-only polity, which has never existed since the Medina city-state until the 19th, 20th century. That's why it's almost the opposite of Western European Catholic pattern, that you start with religious, multi-religious diversity, you end up with more religious.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we've gone over. But we'll have a chance to continue the discussion during the break. Please join me in thanking the speakers.
Thank you, panel, for a great, really insightful and thoughtful presentations. And in conclusion, I would like to give each one of you again a plate and a certificate. First is Hafsa Kanjwal. Dr. Akturk. And Abdullah Al-Arian. We have a break now until 11:50. Our next session will be the challenge of colonialism. Please be here by 11:50. Thank you so much.